Amara was a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her inner light. Raised in a modest household, she had always carried a spirit of optimism, despite the hardships she and her family had faced. Her life wasn't one of luxury, but it was filled with love, integrity, and a deep sense of community. In her small town, everyone knew everyone else, and though it was a simple life, it was a good life. People here didn't just talk about each other, they shared their hopes, their dreams, and their struggles. Relationships were built on trust and values that had been passed down for generations. Honesty, kindness, and loyalty were the foundation of everything. And to Amara, these values were more important than any material wealth. Amara's family had always struggled financially. They didn't have the riches that others might enjoy, but they were rich in love and respect. Her parents worked hard to make ends meet, and though their life was far from glamorous, they held on to their integrity and kept their heads held high. Amara often heard her mother speak of how true love and happiness could not be measured by wealth. A man who loves you for who you are, not what you have, is the man you should hold on to, her mother would say. She also warned Amara to beware of men who were only interested in a woman's possessions or beauty. They wouldn't make good husbands, she said. Real love, her mother often reminded her, is a treasure that can't be bought or sold. Amara carried her mother's wisdom with her into adulthood. She dreamt of finding a man who would see her for who she truly was and love her without conditions. She didn't care about money. She just wanted someone who would be kind, generous in spirit, and most of all, someone who would love her unconditionally. It was with this belief that she entered adulthood, holding on to the hope that one day the right man would come along. Then she met Kehinde. Kehinde seemed like everything Amara had dreamed of. He was handsome, charismatic, and came from a family that appeared to be well off. His presence commanded attention, and he quickly became the center of the local social scene. His charm was undeniable, and his stories about his family's wealth and success made him seem like a man destined for greatness. He spoke of his future with such confidence and ambition that Amara couldn't help but be drawn to him. From their very first meeting, Amara found herself captivated by Kehinde. He had an air of sophistication that made her feel special, and his smooth words wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. They began to spend more time together, and as the days passed, Amara found herself thinking about him constantly. He seemed perfect, polished, confident, and with a plan for the future that aligned with her own dreams. But even in those early days, Amara noticed little things about Kehinde that made her pause. He was a bit too careful when it came to spending money. He always found reasons not to pay for dinner or drinks when they went out. It wasn't that he didn't offer. He just found ways to avoid spending, suggesting cheaper options or pointing out more affordable alternatives. At first, Amara thought it was just a matter of being practical, of being careful with money. But deep down, she wondered if it was something more. Despite these small signs, Amara was enchanted. She was in love with the man who seemed to have it all: looks, charm, ambition, and a future that sparkled with possibilities. It was easy to ignore the small doubts creeping in. After all, no one is perfect, and maybe he just didn't realize how these little things affected her. She would tell herself that love conquers all, and as time went on, the little cracks in Kehinde's persona seemed to vanish, hidden by the sweet promises he whispered and the bright future he painted for them. The more time they spent together, the more Amara fell for him. He seemed to understand her dreams and desires, and he made her believe that they could build a life together, a life where love was the most important thing, and everything else would fall into place. He made her feel like she was the only woman in the world, and for Amara, that was all that mattered. Amara's friends and family had their reservations about Kehinde, though. Her mother, in particular, noticed the little things that didn't sit right. She could see that he wasn't as open-handed as Amara thought. But Amara, in love, and swept up in the excitement of her new relationship, brushed aside her mother's concerns. "He's just cautious with money," she would say, defending him. "He wants to make sure we're both taken care of in the long run." Her friends, too, noticed his tendency to avoid spending on things that seemed trivial to him, but meant a lot to Amara. But Amara, ever the optimist, told herself that he was just being responsible, saving for a future together, and that he would eventually come around. Little did she know, the signs of his true nature were only beginning to unfold. But for now, Amara was blissfully unaware, lost in the fantasy of a love she had always dreamed of. The proposal came in a way that Amara had always dreamed of. Kehinde took her to a charming lakeside park on a warm, golden afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft glow over everything, and the air was filled with the sound of distant birds and the rustling of leaves in the trees. It was the kind of moment that felt like it had been carefully orchestrated, a scene straight out of a fairy tale. As they walked hand in hand by the water, Kehinde stopped, turned to her, and took both of her hands in his. His eyes, usually so confident and poised, were filled with an emotion that Amara had never seen before. Vulnerability, tenderness, and a deep sincerity. He dropped to one knee, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. The diamond inside sparkled in the soft light, reflecting all the dreams of a beautiful future. "Amara," Kehinde said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I love you more than words can express. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, creating memories, building dreams and sharing everything that life has to offer. Will you marry me?" Amara's heart leaped in her chest as she blinked back tears. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them. "Yes, yes, of course I will," she cried, throwing her arms around him, overwhelmed by the love and the beauty of the moment. The engagement was everything Amara had ever imagined. Her friends and family celebrated the occasion with her, showering her with love, gifts, and good wishes. Yet, in the back of Amara's mind, a part of her couldn't shake off the quiet warnings that some of her closest friends had expressed. They had noticed things about Kehinde: his reluctance to offer gifts or share in the costs of smaller events, the tightness in his financial dealings, the way he always seemed to find a reason not to spend more than necessary. But Amara, blinded by love and the overwhelming joy of her engagement, shrugged off their concerns. "He's just careful with money," she would explain. "He wants to make sure we have a strong foundation. We'll be fine." As the wedding date neared, the preparations were in full swing. The ceremony was going to be everything Amara had dreamed of: a lavish affair with hundreds of guests, grand decorations, beautiful flowers, and a long, flowing gown that would make her feel like royalty. And true to form, most of the costs were being covered by Kehinde's family. They were wealthy after all, and they wanted to ensure that the wedding reflected their status. But as the planning continued, there were more and more signs that something was off. Kehinde was incredibly tight-fisted when it came to spending on extras. Even though his family was funding the bulk of the wedding, he was adamant about cutting costs at every turn. The flowers could be cheaper, the venue could be downsized, and the catering should stick to a simpler menu. He was obsessed with the budget, and no matter how much Amara tried to explain her desire for a grand celebration, he would counter with practical suggestions, pointing out how the savings could be invested in their future. Amara's friends and family were starting to feel uneasy. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked gently, pulling her aside one afternoon. "I've noticed that he seems too focused on money. Weddings are meant to be a celebration of love, not just about saving every penny." Amara smiled and kissed her mother's cheek, brushing away the concern. "Mum, he's just being responsible. He loves me. We don't need a huge, expensive wedding to prove that. It's going to be beautiful because we'll be together, and that's all that matters." But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder. Why was he so obsessed with cutting corners? Why was it so difficult for him to understand that this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment for her? Even when they talked about honeymoon plans, Kehinde seemed to favour the least expensive options. Amara had dreamed of going to an exotic beach resort, but Kehinde suggested a simpler, less luxurious destination, claiming that they could save for something grander later. He promised that once they were married and settled, they could live the life they'd both always dreamed of. Despite her lingering doubts, Amara pushed them aside. She didn't want to be a bride filled with regrets or worries. She was marrying the man she loved, and she believed that together they would figure out the rest. Finally, the wedding day arrived. Amara woke up early, heart racing with excitement. The house was filled with laughter and joy as her friends and family helped her prepare. The morning passed in a whirlwind of beauty treatments, dress fittings, and last-minute preparations. And then, she was ready. When Amara stepped into the wedding venue, she felt like she had stepped into a dream. The flowers were exquisite, the decor was tasteful, and the guests filled the room with a buzz of excitement. Kehinde stood at the altar, looking every bit the handsome, charming man she had fallen in love with. He smiled as she walked down the aisle, his eyes filled with adoration. Amara felt like she was floating, caught in the magic of the moment. But as the ceremony progressed, Amara began to notice subtle things that she hadn't before. Kehinde's behavior was impeccable, of course. He was attentive, affectionate, and said all the right words. But when it came time for the traditional gift exchange with his parents, Amara couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. Kehinde didn't give his parents a gift. Instead, he simply smiled and thanked them for their support. Amara didn't think much of it at first, but as the reception went on, more whispers began to circulate among the guests. Some of her relatives, particularly those who had been close to Kehinde's family, began to comment on the fact that Kehinde had refused to cover some of the costs of the wedding. Things like additional entertainment, gifts for the bridesmaids, and even the full cost of the wedding rings. Instead, he insisted that these expenses were unnecessary and that they could simply focus on the ceremony itself. Her closest friends, who had been quietly watching for the last few months, exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what Amara didn't want to see: the cracks in the facade, the hidden truth that was beginning to reveal itself. But Amara, caught up in the emotion of the day, dismissed it all. She refused to let anything spoil her perfect moment. "Love conquers all," she whispered to herself as she stood next to Kehinde, the man she thought she had chosen for all the right reasons. "This is just the beginning of our happily ever after." But deep down, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had overlooked something far more important than love. After the wedding, Amara's excitement was sky high, but little did she know the honeymoon period would not play out as she had imagined. In her mind, she had pictured romantic getaways, extravagant dinners, and sweet, spontaneous moments that would define their early days together. However, the reality was much different. The honeymoon destination was a modest beach resort, far less luxurious than she had envisioned. Kehinde insisted on choosing a place that was affordable, despite Amara's soft hints about her desire for something more special, something memorable. She hadn't expected five-star treatment, but the place felt more like a budget hotel than a honeymoon spot. Kehinde seemed fine with it, even pleased with the low prices. Every moment of their time there was meticulously planned for cost saving, from the travel deals to the meal options. Even when they went to the local market to buy souvenirs, Kehinde insisted on bargaining for the lowest possible price, much to Amara's embarrassment. She tried to remain positive. "He's just practical," she told herself. "He wants to make sure we don't spend unnecessarily. It's a good quality, right?" But deep inside, she couldn't shake the discomfort of feeling like she was living in a dream that wasn't as ideal as it should have been. It didn't stop there. Kehinde's frugality was showing up in even the smallest of moments. At the resort, he was reluctant to tip the hotel staff, explaining that tips should only be given for exceptional service, not as a default. When Amara gently suggested that the bellhop had been particularly helpful with their bags, Kehinde brushed it off, claiming that the staff was just doing their job. Amara's discomfort continued to grow, but she tried to push it aside. She had always believed that love was about accepting each other's flaws. Yet something about this behavior nagged at her, especially when she realized that there was no attempt from Kehinde to surprise her with little thoughtful gestures, no gifts, no flowers, nothing. It wasn't that she was expecting a grand gesture every day, but Amara longed for moments of romantic spontaneity, something to show that he cared in a way that went beyond the practical. The lack of romantic attention weighed heavily on Amara. She confided in her close friend Tola, who had noticed the same issues. "Are you really okay with this?" Tola had asked gently during a phone call. "I mean, it's not just about money, right? It's about what makes you feel loved and appreciated. Does he understand that?" Amara had brushed off Tola's concerns. "I think he's just focused on our future. He wants us to be financially stable, and I understand that. Maybe I'm just being too sensitive." However, things took a turn when Amara tried to bring up her feelings with Kehinde. She casually mentioned how she wanted to experience more of life's pleasures, like dining out at nice restaurants, going on spontaneous trips, or even just spending money on little luxuries for themselves. She didn't expect him to spend recklessly, but she wanted a balance. When she brought it up, Kehinde's reaction was immediate and defensive. "Amara, we don't have the money for that," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "We're just starting out, and we need to be smart about how we spend. What's the point of spending money on things that don't matter? Why go out when we can cook at home? Why travel when we can save for a bigger house?" Amara felt a cold knot in her stomach. She had never heard him speak with such firmness, almost as though she was being unreasonable for wanting to enjoy life. She tried to explain that it wasn't about being wasteful, but about living a little, about making memories that weren't just about saving every penny. But Kehinde wasn't hearing her. His eyes narrowed as he countered. "You're just being materialistic. We can't waste money on things like that. I'm trying to build a future here, Amara. I want us to be successful, and that means cutting back." The tension in the room was palpable, and Amara's heart sank. This was the first time she had seen a side of Kehinde that made her question everything. Was he right? Was she just being selfish? She had always prided herself on being practical, but this was different. It wasn't about living beyond their means. It was about balance, about enjoying life without sacrificing the future. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat and smiled faintly. "I'm not asking for luxury, Kehinde. Just a little joy. A little bit of life that isn't about savings and security." But the conversation ended with a silence that lingered long after the words had been spoken. Amara spent the rest of the evening trying to digest what had just happened. The cracks in their relationship, which had been small and insignificant at first, were now starting to spread. What had felt like a fairy tale beginning was slowly morphing into a reality that she wasn't prepared for. The days that followed were no better. Amara began to notice more small signs of Kehinde's stinginess. On their anniversary, which was just a few weeks after their wedding, Amara had hoped for something: a thoughtful gift, a surprise dinner, or at least a card with a personal note. But all she received was a practical gift card to a home goods store, with a note that read, "For our future home." The disappointment she felt was almost unbearable. She had hoped for a gesture that showed he saw her for who she was. Someone who valued love and affection above all else, not just financial stability. But instead, Kehinde seemed fixated on the future and the material aspects of life, completely overlooking the emotional needs of their relationship. Things only escalated from there. One evening, Amara decided to speak up. She wanted to express how she felt about the lack of romance, the lack of attention to the small things that made her feel special. She needed him to understand that it wasn't just about spending money. It was about creating memories together, about connecting on a deeper level. But when she finally confronted him, asking for something simple, a thoughtful gift or a surprise dinner, Kehinde snapped, You're being materialistic, Amara. Why can't you see that we have more important things to focus on? I'm doing this for us. I don't want to waste money on nonsense. His words stung, and Amara felt her heart shatter a little more. This was the first big fight they had had, and it left Amara feeling confused and conflicted. She loved him, but the more she tried to explain her feelings, the more it seemed like he was closing off. She was trapped between her love for him and the growing realization that something in their relationship was fundamentally wrong. The tension continued to mount as the days went by. Amara felt stifled by his extreme frugality, but she didn't know how to break through to him. She loved him with all her heart, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the man she had married. And as the days passed, she started to wonder if their future would always be defined by his obsession with money, or if she would ever feel truly loved and cherished in the way she had always imagined. Amara's discontent began to grow slowly but surely, like a quiet storm brewing in the distance. At first, she had chalked up Kehinde's stinginess to his practical nature. After all, she had always admired his ambition and his desire for financial security. But as time passed, she began to notice more unsettling patterns in his behavior, patterns she couldn't ignore any longer. Kehinde had become obsessed with saving every penny. Every time they went out shopping, he would scrutinize the price tag, sometimes to the point of discomfort. He would always haggle, even when the difference in price was negligible. Amara had started to feel self-conscious about his constant need to pinch pennies, but she kept quiet, not wanting to cause trouble. After all, it was just his way, right? But then, during a visit to her family's house for a weekend gathering, Amara's embarrassment reached a tipping point. The event was a big one, a family celebration that required contributions from everyone. It was meant to be a fun and joyful occasion, with family coming together to celebrate life's little victories. Amara's mother had made a special request for everyone to chip in, but when it came time to discuss how much they would contribute, Kehinde firmly refused. "I can't afford it," he said matter-of-factly, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "This isn't something we can afford to spend on. We need to save." Amara felt her face flush with embarrassment as she tried to explain to her family why Kehinde wasn't contributing, but they only looked at her with questioning eyes. Amara had always prided herself on being able to balance family and personal life, but now she felt like she was caught between her husband's extreme frugality and her family's expectations. It wasn't just the financial strain that bothered her, it was the isolation that came with it. Kehinde's reluctance to participate in social events, whether it was a family gathering or a friendly outing, was beginning to cut Amara off from the people she loved. He wasn't just avoiding spending money, he was avoiding engagement. Slowly, her once thriving social life began to wither. Amara tried to ignore the whispers. She told herself that it was just a phase. After all, Kehinde loved her, right? And maybe his desire for financial security was just his way of showing he cared. But as weeks passed, the weight of his behavior started to erode her patience. Her friends, who had once seen him as charming and reliable, began to view him with a different lens. They too started noticing his reluctance to spend on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. One evening, during a casual dinner at a friend's house, Amara overheard one of her close friends talking about Kehinde. "I don't know if I'd be able to deal with that, you know," her friend had said. "It's one thing to be careful with money, but this, it's like he doesn't even want to enjoy life." Amara felt a stab of pain as the words cut through her. She tried to laugh it off, but deep inside, she knew it was true. Kehinde wasn't just careful, he was tight-fisted, and it was starting to affect their marriage. Later that night, Amara attempted to talk to him about her growing concerns. She gently expressed how his behavior was starting to isolate them from their loved ones, and how it was making her feel unappreciated. She tried to approach the conversation from a place of understanding, but Kehinde didn't seem to see the problem. "I'm just being responsible," he said dismissively, his face hardening. "We need to be smart about this. We can't waste money on things that don't matter." Why should we spend when we don't have to? Amara's heart sank. She had hoped he would see her perspective, but instead, it felt like her feelings didn't matter at all. Was she overreacting? Was she being too emotional? Maybe I'm the one who's wrong, she thought to herself. After all, he's the one thinking about our future. Maybe I'm just being selfish for wanting to enjoy the present. But as she lay awake that night, doubts began to swirl in her mind. Was her need for simple pleasures really so wrong? Didn't she deserve to feel valued, to experience moments of joy and connection with her partner? Things came to a head one afternoon when Amara walked into their living room and saw Kehinde unboxing a brand new smartphone. It wasn't just any phone. It was the latest model, sleek and expensive. She stood frozen for a moment, shocked by the sight. Kehinde was always so reluctant to spend on anything for her, yet here he was splurging on himself. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Kehinde, how could you justify spending all this money on yourself when you won't even buy a simple gift for me?" He looked up at her with a defensive smile. "It's an investment. I need the latest technology for work. You wouldn't understand." The words hit Amara like a punch to the gut. She had grown so accustomed to him rationalizing his actions, but this felt different. He had no problem indulging in luxuries for himself, yet when it came to her, it was always about saving, about being practical. That evening, as they sat in silence, Amara overheard a conversation between Kehinde and one of his friends on the phone. She had tried to ignore it at first, but she couldn't help but listen in as he talked about their marriage. "You know, I married her because she doesn't ask for much," Kehinde said, his voice filled with pride. "She doesn't need expensive gifts or fancy dinners. It's a good deal for me. I'm smart, man." The words hit Amara like a slap in the face. She had never felt more objectified in her life. Was she just a way for him to get ahead? Was she just a woman who didn't ask for too much, someone who could be content with his bare minimum? Her heart shattered in that moment, and it was then that Amara realized just how deep the divide between them had become. She wasn't just upset about the lack of gifts or luxuries. She was upset because Kehinde had reduced her to someone who was easy to please. That night, Amara confronted him. "Is that really how you see me? Just someone who doesn't ask for much?" Her voice cracked, the hurt overwhelming her. Kehinde looked at her, his face unreadable. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. I'm just being practical. You should be grateful that I'm thinking about our future." But in that moment, Amara realized that there could be no future if there was no room for love, no room for the small moments that made life worth living. She couldn't keep sacrificing her emotional needs for the sake of his financial plans. And as the realization sank in, Amara knew that something had to change. Amara stood in the doorway of their living room, heart pounding in her chest as she faced Kehinde. Her mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. She had never expected their conversation to take this turn, but she was desperate for the truth. What was really going on with him? Why had he been so secretive, so tight-lipped about their finances? "Kehinde," she started, her voice shaking but determined. "I need you to be honest with me. Is this all a game to you? Is this marriage just a way for you to keep up appearances? Because I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it's clearly not." Kehinde stiffened. His usual confident demeanor faltered, and for a moment, Amara thought he might stay silent. But then, slowly, he turned toward her, his expression softening. There was something different in his eyes, something vulnerable that she hadn't seen before. And before she could stop herself, she knew that the truth was about to come pouring out. "I never meant for it to get this far," he began, his voice low. "Amara, I've been lying to you. About everything." The words hit Amara like a slap in the face. She had always known something was off, but the reality of his confession was far worse than she had imagined. She braced herself, trying to stay calm as Kehinde continued, each word like a weight dragging her deeper into a well of disbelief. "The truth is," he said, his eyes avoiding hers, "I'm not as wealthy as I've let you believe. My family's money is mostly in debt. Everything. Our house, the cars, the vacations. It's all just a facade. I wanted to impress you. I wanted you to think I could provide the life you deserved. I thought I could keep up the act until we were married. But now that we're here, I don't know how to tell you the truth." Amara felt the floor beneath her shift, as though the world was tilting. Her mind scrambled to process his words, but they didn't make sense. All the times he had dismissed her concerns about their spending, all the little lies about their finances. It was all a mask, a carefully constructed illusion. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, had built his life on lies. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Amara whispered, her voice cracking as the anger bubbled beneath the surface. "Why wait until now? Why put me through all of this?" Kehinde took a deep breath, his face full of guilt. "I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I could make you believe in this image of a perfect life, you'd stay with me. I didn't want to admit that I'm struggling, that I'm not the man I pretended to be. I've been terrified of failing, Amara, terrified of losing everything, including you." Amara's heart ached. There was a raw honesty in his voice that made her feel for him, even as her anger simmered. She had always known that his obsession with money and security wasn't just about being frugal. It was about something deeper, something buried beneath layers of pride and fear. But this was beyond what she had ever imagined. "You lied to me about everything," Amara said, her words barely audible. "You built a life based on lies. What am I supposed to believe now? How can I trust you again?" Kehinde stepped closer, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Amara, please, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, but I want to fix this, if you'll let me. I want to be honest with you. I want us to work through this together." Amara took a step back, the weight of his confession pressing down on her chest like a stone. She had spent so much time convincing herself that they could make it work, that his quirks were just temporary obstacles. But now, faced with the truth, she didn't know what to think or how to feel. She had spent her whole life believing in love and honesty, and yet here she was, questioning everything. "I don't know what to say, Kehinde," she murmured, tears welling up in her eyes. "You've hurt me in ways I can't even describe. But I also know that you've been living in fear, trying to keep up this illusion of perfection. I don't know if that's enough to forgive you, but it's enough for me to know that you're human. You're flawed, and so am I." For a moment, there was silence between them. Kehinde looked as though he was holding his breath, waiting for her decision. Amara could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear of losing everything he had built, but she wasn't sure if he was ready to face the consequences of his actions. "Amara, please," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you. Let me prove to you that I can change. I'll be honest with you from now on. I'll work harder to fix this. We can rebuild. Together." Amara stared at him for a long moment, her heart torn between love and betrayal. She had always believed that love could conquer all, that honesty was the foundation of any strong relationship. But could she move past the lies? Could she forgive him for what he had done? Finally she spoke, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I love you, Kehinde. But love isn't enough if it's built on lies. You have to be honest with me, not just about money, but about everything. I need to know that you're willing to face the truth, even if it's hard. I can't keep living in a relationship where I don't know what's real and what's not." Kehinde nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I'll do whatever it takes, Amara. I promise. But I need you to be patient with me. I know I've hurt you, and I'll spend every day trying to make it right." Amara took a deep breath, her heart still heavy, but her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. I'll give you one chance, Kehinde, but you need to prove that you're willing to be the man I thought you were. If you can do that, then maybe we have a future. But if you can't, if you keep hiding behind lies and fear, I won't be able to stay." With those words, Amara turned and walked out of the room, leaving Kehinde standing there, a man broken by his own lies, but still clinging to the hope that love could heal the wounds he had caused. Kehinde's change of heart. After a few weeks of tension-filled silence and awkward encounters, Kehinde finally found himself sitting alone in their living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The weight of his actions bore down on him. His lies, his fear, the way he had allowed his insecurities to dictate the course of their marriage. Amara's words haunted him, but they also fueled a desire to make things right. He couldn't stand the thought of losing her, not over something as trivial as his pride and fear of failure. Kehinde sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out a pen, and started to write. Nothing fancy, just his thoughts, his apologies, his commitment to change. He had spent so much time trying to cover up his financial struggles, pretending to be something he wasn't, that he had neglected the one thing that mattered the most: trust. He realized now that without trust, they had nothing. After hours of writing, he found the courage to speak with Amara. They sat down together, and this time, Kehinde was different. His eyes met hers with sincerity, no pretenses, no walls. "Amara," he said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot. You were right about everything. I've let my fears control me, and I've pushed you away in the process. I promise, no more lies. No more hiding. We need to be partners, and that means being transparent about everything, especially money. I know I can't keep hoarding it like it's some kind of security blanket. I want to work together, to figure out a way to live within our means but still find joy in life. I want to change, for us." Amara listened, her eyes filled with both skepticism and hope. Kehinde's words felt like a balm to the wounds that had been inflicted, but she knew actions would speak louder than words. She couldn't just take his promises at face value. She needed to see the change for herself. Amara's growth. Amara, too, had done her own reflection. Her expectations had always been based on what she had imagined a perfect life would look like: luxury, gifts, spontaneous adventures. But now, after the revelations and the heartache, she realized that love wasn't about material things. It wasn't about what you could buy or how much you could flaunt. It was about mutual respect, support, and a shared vision for the future. She had been hurt, yes, but she also understood that Kehinde's extreme frugality wasn't just about money. It was about his fears, his insecurities, and the pressure he felt to live up to expectations that weren't even his own. She knew now that they both had to make adjustments, but the biggest change would come in their approach to life together. They agreed to take small steps, to work on budgeting together, understanding that a balance had to be struck between saving for the future and living in the present. They would no longer avoid spending on the little joys: dinners out, weekend trips, small gifts for each other. They learned that there was room for both financial responsibility and the joy that came with living fully, even if that meant saying goodbye to their unrealistic dreams of perfection. The ending. While the road ahead was still uncertain, Amara and Kehinde began to rebuild their relationship, one small gesture at a time. There were still moments of tension, moments when old habits crept in, but they kept talking, learning to understand each other more deeply with every passing day. They no longer expected a fairy tale. Instead, they were focused on building something real, something grounded in trust, respect, and shared goals. In the evenings, they would sit together and laugh about their past mistakes, finding humor in the messiness of their journey. Amara realized that true wealth wasn't in the things they could buy, but in the moments they shared. The quiet evenings at home, the honest conversations, the laughter that filled their space. And so, though their relationship wasn't perfect, it was theirs. Flawed, complex, but real. They had faced the truth, and in doing so, they had found a new kind of happiness. Together, they were learning that love wasn't about lavish gestures or perfect moments. It was about being there for each other through the highs and lows, the challenges and victories, and that to them was the greatest wealth of all.